Night falls on White Beach 1 on April 22, 1944. The invasion has gone so well that it's a scene of chaos. Mountains of ammunition tower higher than men, and trucks stand bumper to bumper with nowhere to go. 4,000 tons of war material sits exposed beneath the Pacific stars. Along the shoreline, landing craft circle aimlessly, searching for a path inland that exists only on maps. The beach has become a maze of stranded vehicles and exhausted men, trapped between sea and the sheer walls of the Cyclops Mountains that loom 7,000 feet overhead. At 8:43 p.m., the first men hear it, a faint drone echoing through the Cyclops range. Heads turn skyward, yet strangely, radar screens remain empty. Something is coming in low through the darkness. Above the congested shoreline, metal bay doors creak open, and the beach is hit by a deadly, blinding flash. The importance of Hollandia. In the late 1930s, Hollandia was little more than a distant colonial outpost, a small and quiet settlement on the northern coast of Dutch New Guinea that sat on the edge of Humboldt Bay, one of the region's only deepwater harbors. Though its meager port facilities were barely enough to support local trade, its location was ideal. To the east, the coastline stretched toward Wewak, another remote outpost, while to the west, the vast curve of Gilvink Bay led into the wide-open Pacific. Rising behind the town, the massive Cyclops Mountains cut Hollandia off from the interior, their sheer ridges towering over the coastline, climbing past 7,000 feet. The jagged peaks formed a natural wall, isolating everything beneath them. To the south, further beyond and hidden from view, was Lake Sentani, a winding 15-mile-long expanse of water. A single narrow track, barely more than a jungle path, led from this lake to Tanamara Bay, one of the few overland routes in an island where thick jungle and mountainous terrain led the way. But the war changed everything in this sleepy coastal settlement. On April 20th, 1942, the mighty Japanese forces moved in, taking Hollandia without resistance, which quickly transformed it into a key stronghold in the Empire's growing defensive network. In a little over a year, they had carved 3 airfields out of the plains between Lake Sentani and the mountains, with a fourth 5 miles east. By early 1944, Hollandia was the nerve center for Japanese operations in New Guinea, its airstrips housing hundreds and hundreds of fighters, bombers, and transport planes that supported forces across the region. At that moment, 14,000 Japanese troops were stationed in the area, from General Korichika Anami's 2nd Area Army to Lieutenant General Giichi Itahana's 6th Air Division of the 4th Air Army. However, the very mountains that shielded this uniquely located strategic outpost made it nearly impossible to reinforce by land, leaving every supply line heavily dependent on the sea. As the United States began its 3rd year of the war, bigger and stronger than ever, with Japanese control of the waters slipping, Hollandia was about to become the Allies' latest target. The key to the Philippines. In early 1944, General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, set his sights on taking over Hollandia, with the intention to turn it into a staging ground for the drive west along New Guinea's northern coast, through the Netherlands East Indies, and ultimately toward one of the most precious goals in the entire theater, the Philippines. This was perfect timing, as the Allies were now in control of both the skies and the seas around New Guinea. In the first months of the year, MacArthur commanded a mighty invasion force, thousands of troops, hundreds of aircraft, and a fleet of warships, all working around the clock and ensuring the Allies had overwhelming strength in the region. For their part, though the Japanese still had around 60,000 troops in and around New Guinea, shortages of food, ammunition, and equipment had left them isolated and utterly demoralized. Meanwhile, MacArthur's forces were only growing stronger. The American leader's strategy for Hollandia was unprecedented. Instead of striking Wewak, the main Japanese stronghold in northern New Guinea, where the enemy was already expecting an attack, he planned to bypass it entirely by leaping 600 miles up the coast, thus executing the longest amphibious jump yet attempted in the war. Though it was a massive gamble on terrain, logistics, and speed, if it worked, the Allies would gain their strongest foothold yet in the Pacific. If it failed, more than 84,000 troops would be stranded without air support, cut off in some of the most hostile territory in the world. The success or failure of this maneuver rested on the United States Navy's 7th Fleet and their leader, Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, who now faced the immense challenge of coordinating a large seaborne assault across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Tasked with delivering tens of thousands of troops and their equipment to enemy shores, the fleet was pushed to its operational limits. However, the Navy's role in the operation wasn't only about moving troops and ships. It also came down to air power. Risk and reward. In late March, MacArthur met with Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, to hammer out the Navy's role in the operation. He wanted 8 full days of support from the Pacific Fleet's carriers, knowing that air superiority would be critical to securing Hollandia. However, Nimitz, balancing commitments across the Pacific, refused to stretch his fleet that thin, offering only 2 days of carrier air cover after the landings before pulling back. This left a dangerous gap, especially given that the closest Allied airfield was at Nadzab, 500 miles away. To secure a closer airstrip and block any Japanese counterattack, MacArthur ordered a simultaneous landing at Aitape, a lightly held Japanese position on the coast some 125 miles to the east of Hollandia, to seize Taji Airfield and establish a blocking position for any movement to the west by the encircled Japanese forces at Wewak. Operations Reckless and Persecution were set for April 22, 1944. As planning intensified, Allied cryptographers intercepted Japanese codebooks and cracked enemy transmissions, confirming that the enemy still believed the next attack would come at Wewak. Now, with the deception in full effect, the Allies had their moment. For Hollandia, planners chose 2 landing zones, separated by the Cyclops Mountains, whose jungle-covered ridge would make communications between forces nearly impossible once the battle began. To the west was a determined landing zone at Tanamura Bay, the safer bet, as intelligence suggested only light resistance, and a road leading inland offered a direct path to the airfields. There, the 24th Infantry Division, led by Major General Frederick Irving, would land at Red Beaches 1 and 2, advance inland, and seize the airstrips. Meanwhile, all the way in the east was Humboldt Bay, a completely different area, where the 41st Infantry Division, under Major General Horace Fuller, faced a far more complicated landing, as the beaches were narrow and surrounded by thick mangrove swamps, where entire battalions could get bogged down in soft, sinking earth. Adding to the challenge, 1 battalion had to land at White Beach 3, push across a thin and exposed peninsula, and then reassemble for a second landing deeper in the bay to secure the inland route to the airfields. But the invasion couldn't begin until the Allies broke Japan's ability to strike back. Securing the seas. Before the invasion fleet even set sail, the Allies had already begun dismantling Japanese air power across the Pacific. In late March, aircraft from the U.S. 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force launched devastating strikes along the New Guinea coast, from Wewak to Biak, targeting enemy airfields and supply routes. Task Force 58 struck on March 30th, 1944. A wave of carrier-based fighters and bombers roared over the Palau Islands, tearing into Japanese airfields, fuel depots, and coastal defenses for 3 whole days, ripping apart runways and igniting supply caches before returning to fast carriers USS Enterprise, Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Hornet. By April 1st, the devastation was complete. The Japanese combined fleet, now vulnerable and unable to defend its bases, withdrew westward to the Philippines. With a major naval threat removed, the United States 5th Air Force unleashed more than 80 B-24 Liberators, escorted by long-range P-38 Lightnings in a relentless bombing campaign over Hollandia's airfields. By mid-April, the area was in ruins, and more than 340 Japanese aircraft lay wrecked across the runways, with dozens more shot down over the jungle. The scale of the loss was so great that the commander of Japan's 6th Air Division was dismissed in disgrace. Now, with Japanese air and naval power in retreat and the enemy reeling, the stage was set for the landings. By April 20th, the invasion fleet was in motion. Off the shores of Manus Island, a massive armada assembled, where more than 200 ships, from troop transports and landing craft to minesweepers, moved, and supply vessels stretched across the horizon, preparing to strike Hollandia once and for all. Engines rumbled, signal flags snapped in the wind, and final checks were made before the fleet pushed into enemy waters. Despite all planning and intelligence, the men on board the ships knew Japanese submarines still lurked beneath the Pacific, and no one knew if the enemy had kept aircraft hidden beyond the reach of reconnaissance. Nonetheless, the reckless task force, The main invasion force steamed westward in formation, carrying the 24th and 41st Infantry Divisions toward their landing beaches at Tanamara Bay and Humboldt Bay. Sailing right alongside them was the Persecution Task Force, moving toward Aitape, with the 163rd Regimental Combat Team prepared for their assault. Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid's 7th Fleet escorted the convoys, with cruisers USS Phoenix and Boise, battleships USS Pennsylvania and New Mexico, and a screen of destroyers providing firepower. Overhead, escort carriers USS Natoma Bay, Coral Sea, and Manila Bay launched air patrols, ensuring nothing threatened the Armada as it moved into enemy waters. On April 21st, the ships carrying the Aitape invasion force broke apart and veered southeast, disappearing into the night toward their landing beaches. The rest of the Armada pressed on toward Hollandia. Hitting the shoreline. In the early hours of April 22, 1944, the main invasion force divided for the final time. The 41st Infantry Division, part of the Central Attack Group, turned toward Humboldt Bay, while the 24th Infantry Division of the Western Attack Group shifted course for Tanamara Bay. More than 200 ships, troop transports, LSTs, destroyers, cruisers, and escort carriers moved into position, prepared to deliver the largest amphibious leap of the war. At first light, the two invasion fleets began their pre-invasion bombardment. Aircraft from a carrier task force made bombing and strafing runs, sending opening salvos racing toward the jungle-covered coast. As the initial waves of Allied troops splashed ashore at beaches 1 and 2, leaving their landing craft behind and sinking their boots into the wet sand, the Allied men braced for resistance. But instead of the brutal firefight many had expected, they were met with silence. Only a few scattered rifle shots cracked from the jungle. The deception had worked. Out of the 7,600 Japanese troops in the area, the vast majority were service personnel, cooks, laborers, and clerks, not combat troops. Only 1 in 10 carried a rifle. Caught completely off guard, most of the enemy soldiers panicked and fled into the dense jungle, vanishing into the thick undergrowth as the Americans pressed inland. As more and more landing craft churned sloppily toward the shore, they brought wave after wave of troops and supplies onto the beaches. The first units moved quickly, searching for the old Dutch road, the supposed route inland that would take them toward the airfields at Lake Sentani. But as more men and equipment piled up along the sand, it became clear that there was no road at all. According to naval historian Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, quote, "There simply was no way to get men or vehicles off this beach except by the way they had come. They might as well have landed at the base of an unscalable cliff." Beachhead bottleneck. Now on land, the pre-invasion bombardment at Humboldt Bay had done its work. A Japanese ammunition dump at White Beach 1 was already in flames, its explosion sending up columns of thick black smoke before the first landing craft even reached shore. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of burning fuel and cordite. Scattered across the sand lay abandoned Japanese supplies, rations, munitions, and even live aviation bombs. One soldier took it all in and muttered in disbelief, quote, "The largest Japanese ammunition dump I've ever seen." The first waves of troops pushed inland, but the terrain pushed back harder. Ahead of them, the jungle was a wall of tangled roots and thick undergrowth, impossible to move through. As the trucks and jeeps rolled off the landing craft, the wet sand and swampy terrain trapped them almost instantly. Wheels spun uselessly. Engines roared, then sputtered. Finally, when the well-prepped 116th Engineer Battalion came ashore, ready to carve an exit route, the so-called Old Dutch Road, supposed to connect the beaches at Tanamara Bay to Lake Sentani, was nothing more than a faint, overgrown trail, impassable for vehicles. With no way forward, the men turned to a more pressing task, unloading the ships before nightfall. Offshore, no less than 7 landing ship tanks, all packed with food, fuel, and ammunition, had to be emptied quickly, or they would remain dangerously exposed in the shallows. The work was brutal. Men heaved crates, guided jeeps through unstable sand, and waded through the surf to help bring in supplies as fast as they could. But without an exit road, the cargo had nowhere to go. As the day wore on, the situation spiraled. Piles of equipment grew into mountains, the beach choked with crates, fuel drums, and disassembled vehicles. Trucks sat bumper to bumper, unable to move. Landing craft circled offshore, waiting for space to unload, their frustrated crews watching the gridlock unfold, and all the while, more and more supplies kept coming. By nightfall, White Beach 1 had more than 4,000 tons of supplies, and 300 vehicles were now trapped in the open, stacked high with fuel, ammunition, and rations, a logistical nightmare. But worse than that, it was a target. Inferno at White Beach 1. Just before nightfall, around 8:45 p.m., as troops settled in for the night, the distant hum of an approaching aircraft broke the stillness. It was a single Japanese bomber, flying too low for radar detection and slipping past the mountains. Flying into White Beach 1 fast, the bomber's bay doors opened, sending 3 bombs tumbling through the darkness. The first struck the jungle beyond the beach, kicking up a useless geyser of dirt and flame. The second hit the shoreline, throwing sand and water over the stacked crates and fuel drums. The third bomb slammed into an abandoned Japanese ammunition dump. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the night erupted into a massive fireball ripping through the stockpile, its shockwave shattering crates and sending shrapnel tearing across the beach. From his position on Pancake Hill, Captain Eugene File could only watch as the chain reaction began, quote, continuous, some blast shaking the earth even a mile away. Then, the fire reached an American fuel dump. The first gasoline drums burst, spewing flames into the air, then another and another. The Inferno illuminated the jungle, casting wild shadows against the palm trees as a roaring wall of fire spread across the shoreline. One company, sleeping near the blast zone, never had a chance to wake up. For what seemed like hours to the men on the burning beaches, debris rained down in all directions, and bullets from the ammo dump whizzed through the air. There was a deafening mix of crackling flames, shattering wood, men screaming, and the relentless thud of secondary explosions. Working non-stop, the 532nd engineers worked frantically to contain the blaze. Bulldozers shoved debris aside, and men hurled crates of ammunition into the sea, desperate to stop the fire from spreading. And just when they had it under control, the fire hit another ammunition dump, causing a massive detonation and tearing through the supply stacks. Watching from the waves. Even from a long distance away, the flames at White Beach 1 could be seen racing skyward. Men on the decks of transports and warships muttered among themselves, unsure whether they were witnessing an enemy attack or an accident spiraling out of control. As the sun rose, the full scope of the devastation came into view, the heat so intense that even offshore, men could feel it radiating over the water. From aboard one of the LSTs, Major Elmer Vogenow described, quote, the Holocaust on White Beach, as viewed from the sea, was so awesome and terrifying as almost to defy description. Great billowing black clouds of smoke were flung thousands of feet into the air from exploding drums of gasoline, while the oil, lubricants, rations, vehicles, and hundreds of tons of miscellaneous stores and gear burned below it in a solid, hideous, frightening wall of flame 500 feet in the air for a mile and a half along the beach. The next morning, on April 24th, a dozen LSTs approached Humboldt Bay, all ready to unload and depart on the same day. But as they neared shore, seeing the fire, some captains held back and decided to instead watch the disaster unfold from a distance. Efforts to contain the fire proved futile. Minesweepers and small craft attempted to approach, but their portable pumps were useless against the sheer scale of the blaze. By midday, the inferno had grown too intense. All personnel were forced to abandon the area. Vogenow later called the destruction unimaginable. The fires prevented any successful unloading for 2 days, forcing much of the cargo to be rerouted to White Beach 4 across Jautefa Bay to avoid further congestion. The fire at White Beach 1 had wiped out an entire shipment of supplies, 11 LST loads worth, valued at $8 million. The loss was felt immediately. General Eichelberger quickly radioed for an emergency resupply, but it would take at least a week for replacements to arrive. Until then, rationing was the only option. Troops were reduced to 1/3 rations, surviving on a single box of K-rations per day. Desperate for anything extra, patrols searched abandoned Japanese positions, finding only a few bags of rice and canned salmon. Even cigarettes, a prized morale booster, disappeared overnight. Despite the strained supply lines, slowed operations, and ration shortages, the invasion pressed forward. Victory at Hollandia. By April 25th, Allied troops were finally pushing inland, slowly crossing Lake Sentani aboard amphibious tractors and advancing toward the 3 airfields that had been the invasion's primary objective. Aside from a few scattered gunfights, the airfields were in Allied hands by the following day. Even as patrols swept the jungle, expecting a last-ditch counterattack, the reality became clear. The enemy had been caught entirely off guard. Within a few days, American aircraft were already lifting off from Hollandia. At Itape, where a regiment from the 41st Infantry Division and another from the 32nd Infantry Division had landed a couple of days earlier, the story was much the same. The Japanese had already withdrawn inland, leaving 3 airfields undefended. Within 2 days, Australian engineers had 1 strip operational, and an Australian fighter squadron moved in, supporting patrols as they pushed west. After the Battle of Hollandia, more than a mile of beachfront lay blackened, littered with the charred wreckage of vehicles and smoldering debris from the fire at White Beach 1. Despite the destruction, MacArthur's bold leap behind enemy lines was a resounding success. Historian Edward J. Dray later wrote that the success of the operation was mainly due to the leader's bold decision to make the 600-mile jump, paired with exploiting intelligence gained through code-breaking, calling it, quote, MacArthur's finest hour in World War II and Ultra's single greatest contribution to the General's Pacific strategy. The airfields, battered from months of bombing, were rebuilt and expanded, though the swampy terrain forced the original 6-airfield plan down to 3. Around Lake Sentani, an entire military city sprang up. Troop camps, supply depots, and command centers for MacArthur's growing force. The U.S. 7th Fleet, along with 6th and 8th Armies, now ran their operations from here, while Humboldt Bay swarmed with ships, repair docks, and constant supply runs. At Tanamara Bay, fuel depots kept the war machine moving. What had once been a forgotten jungle outpost was now the launch pad for the Philippines and beyond.